Good morning and most welcome to 1157. We are presently at the local library here in my quarters. It is called Lundby Bibliotek. It's a quite pleasant environment, maybe a bit too bright light, but at least we have fresh air. Speaking of subjects, I realized for some reason, I don't know how that happened, I skipped a very interesting philosopher, scientist, author. And although I've been acquainted with him for quite some time, I never understood that he is important and needs to be brought up. And that person is Julian, and I've been a little bit surprisingly here for my colleague, Julian Jaynes. And when he came up again in the work of Ian McGilchrist, who leads a lot on Julian Jaynes, still the coin didn't drop into the coin box. And that is interesting, it's very surprising. But all of a sudden today, early in the morning, I realized he's very important. And what he writes could be a very significant breakthrough. And we'll give it a try. We'll see here. It's an article, sort of an excerpt of his research and findings. It's called Consciousness and the Voices of the Mind by Julian Jaynes. Julian Jaynes was born in West Newton, Massachusetts. Julian Jaynes did his undergrad work at Harvard and McGill and received both his master's and doctoral degrees in psychology from Yale, while the psychology department at Princeton, which he joined in 1964, is still his academic base. Dr. Jaynes has had numerous positions as visiting lecturer or scholar in residence in departments of philosophy, English, and archaeology, and in numerous medical schools. His big publish came in 1976, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I will put it in the description. Few problems have had as interesting an intellectual trajectory through history as that of the mind and its place in nature. Before 1859, the year that Darwin and Wallace independently proposed natural selection as the basis of evolution, this issue was known as the mind-body problem, with its various and sometimes ponderous solutions. But after that pivotal date, it came to be known as the problem of consciousness and its origin in evolution. Could I ask my colleague to turn this off? It's sort of bothering me. I think one is enough. You have to the left of the order. Okay, thank you very much. This is still a good picture?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, the first thing I wish to stress this morning is this problem. It is easy for the average layman to understand, but paradoxically, for philosophers, psychologists, neurophysiologists, who had been so used to different kind of thinking, it is quite a difficult thing. What we have to explain is the contrast, so obvious to a child, between all the inner covert world of imaginings and memories and thoughts compared to the external public world around us. The theory of evolution beautifully explains the anatomy of species, but how out of mere matter, mere molecules, mutations, anatomies, can you get this rich inner experience that is always accompanying us during the day and in our dreams at night? That is the problem we will consider in this symposium. Previous solutions, for instance, the helpless spectre theory of Huxley. I like that one, I heard that one before. That consciousness just watched behavior and could do nothing. But if that is true, why is it there at all? And so there followed emergent revolution, which was meant to save us from such pessimistic view. It was most fully developed by Lloyd Morgan, although the idea goes back to the 19th century. A simple example is water. If you take hydrogen and oxygen, you can't derive the wetness of water from either. Wetness is an emergent. Similarly, when in evolution there is a certain amount of brain tissue, then suddenly you get consciousness. Consciousness is an emergent, underived from anything before. It is also having a renaissance in the writings of some neuroscientists today. On analysis, it generates no hypothesis and tells us nothing about any processes involved. Emergent evolution is a label that bandages our ignorance. What I shall now present is a different kind of solution, and one that has surprised me in the wealth of specific and testable hypotheses which it generates, and surprised me in the direction into which my work has been forced. But first, we must face squarely the question of what is consciousness. And as a preface to that, I will first outline a few things that consciousness is not. First, consciousness is not all of mentality. You know this perfectly well. There are so many things that the nervous system does automatically for us. All the variety of perceptual constancies, for example, size, brightness, color, shape, which our nervous system preserves under widely varying environmental changes of light, distance, angle of regard, or even our own moving about, in which objects retain the same position called location constancy. All done without any help of an introspective consciousness. So, with another large class of activities that can be called preoptive, such as how we sit, walk, move. All these are done without consciousness, unless we decide to be conscious of them. The preoptive nature of consciousness. Even in speaking, the role of consciousness is more interpolative than any constant companion to my words. I am not now consciously entering my lexical storehouse and consciously selecting items to string on these syntactical structures. Instead, I have what can be best described as intentions of certain meanings, what I call structions, and then linguistic habit patterns which take over without further input from my consciousness. Similarly, in hearing someone speak, what are you, the listener, conscious of? If it were a flow of phonemes, or even the next level up of morphemes, or even words, you would not be understanding what I am intending. Consciousness is sometimes confused even with the simple sense perception. Historically, we inferred and abstracted ideas of sense perception from a realization of our sense organs. And then, because of prior assumptions about mind and matter, or soul and body, we believe these processes to be due to consciousness, which they are not. I think you are forced to follow a path to a reductio ad absurdum. You will then have to say that since all animals have sense perceptions, all are conscious, and so on back through the evolutionary tree, even to one-cell protozoa, because they react to external stimuli, or one-cell plants like the algae Chlamydomonas, with its visual system analogous to ours. Thence to even amoeboid weight cells of the blood, since they sense bacteria and devour them. Second, consciousness do not copy experience. This further error stems from the beginning of empiricism, when Locke, 1690, spoke of the mind's white paper void of all characters, without any ideas, on which experience is copied, like a blank piece of paper Had the camera been around at the time, I suggest Locke would have used it instead of a blank paper as his foundational metaphor. In experience, we take successive pictures of the world, immerse them in developer of reflection, and watch concepts, memories, and all our mental furnishing come into existence. But that consciousness does not copy experience can be shown very easily. A, by examining the absence of memories that we should have if consciousness did not copy experience, such as knowing what letters go with what numbers on telephones. Although we have stared at the matter thousands of times, most of us cannot say, and countless other examples, or B, by examining the memories we have and noting that they are not structured the way we experience them, such as thinking of the last time you were swimming. Most people, instead of thinking of the complicated visual, thermal, proprioceptive, respiratory experience as it actually was, tend to see themselves swimming from another point of view. A bird's eye view, perhaps. Something, of course, that they have never experienced at all. The conscious memory does not copy experience, but reconstruct them as a must have been. This view is similar to some of the recent constructivist theories of memories. Third, consciousness is not necessary for learning, which I referred to a moment ago as the mistake I labored under for so long. If we look at the most primitive kinds of learning, such as Pavlovian conditioning, it occurs in preparations such as a hind leg of a beheaded cockroach, for which no one would think that consciousness is plausible. And in humans, not only does consciousness not assist in acquisition of conditions, responses, it destroys conditioning. Once the human being is conscious of the contingencies. A more complicated kind of learning is instrumental learning, or operant conditioning, or we would call it a learning solutions to problems. This is the old psychological problem called learning without awareness. Psychologists will remember the Greenspoon effect and some of the studies of the instrumental learning of little muscular moments without consciousness. It is more problematic than I can go into here, but I think that we can show that instrumental learning can occur without consciousness. This is not to say that consciousness does not play a role in these different types of human learning. It does, as in the decision as what to learn, or making rules of how to learn better, or consciously verbalizing aspects of a task. But this is not the learning itself. And my point is that consciousness is not necessary for learning to occur. One could here bring up the well-known phenomenon of automation of habit. For when this happens to us, it seems that the task has required consciousness at the beginning. But as the habit is perfected, consciousness eases away and the task is performed effortlessly. This same smoothing out and increased rapidity of performance of a habit with practice is universal among all animals that learn. Generally, in this ubiquitous phenomenon, it is not necessarily or basically the lapsing of consciousness with improved performance so much as the lapsing of forced attention to components of the task. And attention, specifically external attention, which is the focusing of sense perception, is not necessarily conscious. The fourth thing for which consciousness is not necessary, and it may seem rather paradoxical, is thinking or reasoning. Here we are getting into perhaps the major problem in this area, the definition of our terms, particular terms such as thinking and reasoning. If we take the simplest definition of thinking, I think that we can show indeed that consciousness is not necessary for it. This concerns one of the forgotten experiments in psychology. And yet, to me, it is important in the history of psychology as the very complicated Michelson-Morley experiment in the history of physics. What are the chances? Wow.
Can you repeat the sentence? It's so important.
And yet, to me, it is as important in the history of psychology as the very complicated Michelson-Morley experiment is in the history of physics. Synchronicity, I would say. My hairs are standing on the skin.
What is so important? So consciousness.
Comes here. Patience. As the letters show that the ether did not exist, setting the stage for relativity theory, so the experiment I am about to describe show that thinking is not conscious, setting the stage for the kind of theorizing I am describing here. The experiment I refer to was first done in 1901 by Karl Marbe. Back in a scientific world when consciousness, was being intensely studied for the first time, 1901. Using his professors as subjects, each of whom had had extensive experience of experiments in introspection. He asked them to make a simple judgment between two identical looking weights as to which was the heavier. against the background of the experimental psychology of the time, the results was astonishing. There was no conscious content for the actual judgments itself, although such a judgment was embedded in the consciousness of the problems, its materials and techniques. So began what came to be called the Würzburg school of imageless thought, which led through experiments by Eick, Watt, Kulpe and others to concepts such as set, Aufgabe and determining tendency. Which I, for myself, has renamed Structions, S-T-R-U-C-T-I-O-N, Structions. Structions are like instructions given to the nervous system that, when presented with the materials to work on, result in the answer automatically without any conscious thinking or reasoning. And this phenomenon applies to most of our activities, from such simplicities as judging weights, to solving problems, to scientific and philosophical activity. Consciousness studies a problem and prepares it as a struction, a process which may result in a sudden appearance of the solution, as if out of nowhere. During the World War II, British physicists used to say that they no longer made the discoveries in the laboratory, that they had their 3 Bs where the discoveries were made: the bath, the bed, and the bus. And as I have mentioned earlier, this process on a smaller scale is going in me at present as I'm speaking. My words are as if chosen for me by my nervous system after giving it the structure of my intended meaning. Finally, in this list of my misconceptions about consciousness, a word about its location. Most people, with possibly the present company excepted, who had thought long about the problem and so place it out there in the intellectual domain, tend to think of their consciousness much as Descartes, Locke, and Hume did, as a space usually located inside their heads, particularly when we make eye-to-eye contact. We tend to, in a subliminal way, infer that such space in others. There is, of course, no such space whatever. The space of consciousness, which I shall hereafter call mind space, is a functional space that has no location except as we assigned one to it. To think of our consciousness as inside our heads as reflected in and learned from our words like introspection or internalization, is a very natural but arbitrary way to do it. I certainly do not mean to say that consciousness is separate from the brain. By the assumption of natural science, it is not. But we use our brains in riding bicycles, and yet no one considers that the location of bicycle riding is in our heads. The phenomenal location of consciousness is arbitrary. I would say non-localized. Enough. To sum up so far, we have shown that consciousness is not all mentally, not necessary for sensation or perception, that it is not a copy of experience, nor necessary for learning, nor even necessary for thinking and reasoning, and has only an arbitrary and functional location. As a prelude to what I'm going to say later, I wish you consider that there could have been at one time human beings who did most of the things we do: speak, understand, perceive, solve problems, but who were not conscious. I think this is a very important possibility. So far, this is almost going back to a radical behaviorist position. Yeah, I was actually thinking that. But what then is consciousness, since I regard it as an irreducible fact that my introspections, retrospections, and imaginations do indeed exist. My procedure here will be to outline in a somewhat terse fashion a theory of consciousness, and then to explain it in various ways. What consciousness is. Subjective conscious mind is an analog of what we call the real world. It is built up with a vocabulary or lexical field whose terms are all metaphors or analogues of behavior in the physical world. Its reality is of the same order as mathematics. It allows us to shortcut behavioral processes and arrive at more adequate decisions. Like mathematics, it is an operator rather than a thing or a repository. And it is intimately bound with volition and decision. Consider the language we use to describe conscious processes. The most prominent group of words used to describe mental events are visual. We see solutions to problems, the best of which may be brilliant or clear, or possibly dull, fuzzy, obscure. These words are all metaphors, and the mind space to which they apply is generated by metaphors of actual space. In that space we can approach a problem, perhaps from some viewpoint, grapple with its difficulties. Every word we use to refer to mental events is a metaphor or analog of something in the behavioral world. And the adjectives that we use to describe physical behavior in real space are analogically taken over to describe mental behavior in mind space. We speak of the conscious mind as being quick or slow, or somebody being nimble-witted, or strong-minded, or weak-minded, or broad-minded, or deep, or open, or narrow-minded. And so, like a real space, something can be at the back of our mind, or in the inner recesses, or beyond our minds. But you will remind me, metaphor is a mere comparison and cannot make new entities like consciousness. A proper analysis of metaphor shows quite the opposite. In every metaphor there are at least two terms. The thing we are trying to express in words, the metaphrand, and the term produced by struction to do so, a metaphor. These are similar to what Richards called the tenor and the vehicle, terms more suitable to poetry than to psychological analysis. I have chosen metaphrand and metaphor instead to have more of a connotation of an operator by echoing the arithmetic terms of multiplicand and multiplier. If I say the ship plows the seas, the metaphrand is the way the bow goes through the water, and the metaphor is a plow. As a more relevant example, suppose a person, back in the time at the formation of our mental vocabulary, has been trying to solve some problem or to learn how to perform some task. To express his success, he might suddenly exclaim, "Aha! I see the solution." See is a metaphor drawn from the physical behavior from the physical world. That is applied to this otherwise inexpressible mental occurrence, the metaphrand. But metaphor usually have associations called paraphors that project back into the metaphrand. as what are called para-friends, and indeed create new entities. The word see has associations of seeing in the physical world, and therefore of space. This space becomes a para-friend as it is united with the inferred mental event called a meta-friend. In this way, the spatial quality of the world around us is being driven into the psychological fact of solving a problem, which I indicated needs no consciousness, and it is the associated spatial quality that, as a result of language used to describe such psychological events, becomes, with constant repetition, this spatial quality of our consciousness or mind space. This mind space I regard as the primary feature of consciousness. It is the space which you preoptively are introspecting on this very moment. But who does the seeing? And who does the introspecting? Here we introduce analogy, which differ from metaphor in that the similarity is between relationships rather than between things or actions. As the body with its sense organs, referred to as I, is to the physical seeing, so there develops automatically an analog I to relate to this mental kind of seeing in mind space. The analog I is the second most important feature of consciousness. It is not to be confused with the self, which is an object of consciousness in later development. The analog I is contentless, related, I think, to Kant's transcendental ego. As the bodily I can move about in its environment, looking at this or that, so the analog I learns to move about in mind space, concentrated on one thing or another. If you saw yourself swimming in our earlier example, it was your analog I that was doing the seeing. A third feature of consciousness is narratization, the analogic simulation of actual behavior. It is an obvious aspect of consciousness which seem to have escaped previous synchronic discussions on consciousness. Consciousness is constantly fitting things into a story, putting A before an after around any event. This feature is an analog of our physical selves moving about through a physical world with its spatial successiveness, which becomes the successiveness of time in mind space. And this results in the conscious conception of time, which is a spatialized time in which we locate events and indeed our lives. It is impossible to be conscious of time in any other way than as space. There are other features of consciousness which I shall simply mention. Concentration, the inner analog of external perceptual attention. Suppression, by which we stop being conscious of any annoying thoughts. The analog of turning away from annoyances in the physical world. Excerption, the analog of how we sense only one thing or one aspect of a thing at a time. And consilience, the analog of perceptual assimilation and others. In no way is my list meant to be exhaustive. The essential rule here is that no operation goes on in consciousness that was not in behavior first. All of these are learned analogues of external behavior. Psychologists are sometimes justly accused of the habit of reinventing the wheel and making it square and then call it a first approximation. I would demur from agreement that this is true in the development I have just outlined. But I would indeed like to call it a first approximation. Consciousness is not a simple matter, and it should not be spoken of as if it were. Nor have I mentioned the different modes of narratization in consciousness, such as verbal, perceptual, bodily, or musical, all of which seem quite distinct with properties of their own. But it is not enough, I think, to allow us to go back to the evolutionary problem as I stated in the beginning, and which has caused so much trouble in biology, psychology, and philosophy. I think Julian Jaynes is quite a witty chap. When did all this inner world begin? Here we arrive at the most important watershed in our discussion. Saying that consciousness is developed out of language means that everybody from Darwin on, including myself in the early years, was wrong in trying to trace the origin of consciousness biologically or neurophysiologically. It means that we have to take a look at human history after language has evolved and ask when in history did an analog I, narratizing in mind space, begin? When did language evolve? Elsewhere, I have outlined ideas of how language could have evolved from what I call modification, which has been called the Wahi-Wahoo model and is present in competition with several others. But such theorizing points to the late Pleistocene or Neanderthal era on several grounds. One, such a period coincides with an evolutionary pressure over the last glacial period for verbal communication in the hunting of large animal. Two, it coincides with the astonishing development of the particular area of the brain. involved in language, and 3, what is unique in this theory, it corresponds to the archaeological record of an explosion of tool artifacts. For we know that language is not just communication, but also acts like an organ of perception, directing attention and holding attention on a particular object or task, and making advanced tool making possible. This dating means that language is no older than 50,000 years, which means that consciousness developed sometime between that date and the present. The bicameral mind. First, let me make a few generalizations about the Iliad. To me and to roughly half of classicists, it is oral poetry, originally spoken and composed at the same time by a long succession of oidoi, or bards. As such, it contains many incongruities, even after it was written down in about 800 BC, perhaps by someone named Homer. It had many interpolations added to it even centuries later. But if you take the generally accepted older parts of the Iliad and ask, is there evidence of consciousness? The answer, I think, is no. People are not sitting down and making decisions. No one is. No one is introspecting. No one is even reminiscing. It is a very different kind of a world. Then who makes the decisions? Well, whenever a significant choice is to be made, a voice comes in telling people what to do. These voices are always and immediately obeyed. These voices are called gods. To this, it is the origin of gods. I regard them as auditory hallucinations, similar to, although not precisely the same, as the voices heard by Joan of Arc or William Blake, or similar to the voices that modern schizophrenics hear, similar perhaps to the voices that some of you may have heard. While it's regarded as a very significant symptom in the diagnosis of schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations also occur in some form at some time in about half the general population. I have also corresponded with or interviewed people who are completely normal in function, but who do suddenly have a period of hearing extensive verbal hallucinations, usually of a religious sort. Verbal hallucinations are common today, but in early civilization, I suggest that they were universal. This mentality in early times, as in the Iliad, is what is called the bicameral mind, on the metaphor of a bicameral legislature. It simply means that human mentality at this time was in two parts. a decision-making part and a follower part. Neither part was conscious in the sense which I had described consciousness. And I would like to remind you here of the rather long critique of consciousness with which I began my talk. Which demonstrated that human beings can speak and understand, learn, solve problems, and do much that we do, but without being conscious. So could bicameral man, in his everyday life, he was a creature of habit. But when some problems arose that needed new decisions or more complicated solutions than habit could provide, that decision stress was sufficient to instigate an auditory hallucination. Because such individuals had no mind space in which to question or rebel. Such voices had to be obeyed. But why is there such a mentality as a bicameral mind? Let us go back to the beginning of civilization in several sites in Near East around 9000 BC. It is concomitant while the beginning of agriculture. The reason the bicameral mind may have existed at this particular time is because of evolutionary pressure for a new kind of social control. To move from small hunter-gatherer groupings to large agriculture-based towns or cities. The bicameral mentality could do this since it enabled a large group to carry around with them the directions of the chief or king as verbal hallucinations instead of the chieftain having to be present at all time. I think that verbal hallucinations had evolved along with the evolution of language during Neanderthal era as aids to attention and perseverance in tasks, but then because the way of the ruling larger groups. It can easily be inferred that human beings with such a mentality had to exist in a special kind of society, one rigidly ordered in a strict hierarchies with strict expectancies organized into the mind so that the hallucinations preserve the social fabric. And such was definitely the case. Bicameral kingdoms were all hierarchical theocracies, with a god, often an idol, at their head from whom hallucinations seemed to come, or more rarely with a human being who was divine and whose actual voice was heard as hallucinations. Such civilization start in various sites in the Near East and then spread into Egypt, later from Egypt into the Kush in southern Sudan, and then into Central Africa, while in the other geographical directions they spread into Anatolia, Crete, Greece, and then into India and southern Russia. A millennium later, a series of civilizations begin in Mesoamerica, leading up to the Aztecs, and then partly independent and partly by illusion, another series of civilization of the Andean highlands leading up to the Inca. Where writing exists after 3000 BC, we can see this bicameral civilization much more clearly. In Mesopotamia, the head of state was a wooden statue. Wooden so it could be carried about, with jewels in its eyes, perfumed, richly raimented, embedded in ritual, seated behind a large table in the Gigunu, which was a large hall in the bottom of a ziggurat. I want to mention that the evidence from written texts, personal idols, cylinder seals, and the construction of personal names suggest that every person had a personal god. In Mesopotamia, it was his Ili, which in Hebrew is perhaps from the same root as Eli, and Elohim. In Egypt, the personal god, which had the same function, was called Akka, a word which has been an enigma in Egyptology until now. In connection with the personal god, it is possible to suggest that a part of our innate bicameral heritage is the modern phenomena of imaginary playmate. According to my own research as well as other data, it occurs in at least 1/3 of modern children between the ages of 2 and 5 years, and is believed now to involve very real verbal hallucinations. In rare cases where the imagery playmate lasts beyond the juvenile period, it is too grows up with the child and begins telling him or her what to do in times of stress. It is therefore possible that this is how the personal god started in the bicameral times. The imaginary playmate growing up with a person in a society of expectancies that constantly encouraged the child to hear voices and to continue to do so. I think we'll do some summary here. What are your question, yes?
Yes, so it's interesting what you brought up about consciousness and relation to language. Would it be possible to assume that consciousness is synonymous with language, or roughly synonymous? That or what would you say?
I have to say that I'm a bit shocked directly from the text, so I still don't get it. It is very different. I would try to capture it in this way as a first start, and then I will get back to your question when I understand it.
Could you please clarify this for? It's something is missing there, I think. See indications coming from Paraparatversi.
I will go through this now. This is my conclusion here.
Okay, yes,
and
fine.
So we start. So I read now for the first time. I have to be honest, I haven't looked very much into Julian Jaynes. I did a shortcut conclusion since I saw that Ian McGilchrist went past him. and I realized that was absolutely wrong. This is not very good thinking from my part, and I do apologize to you listeners here. I should have brought up Julian Jaynes much earlier, but I will do my best to understand him and try to convey him. The first thing you can say, and this is something, it's coming from most of the people we've been reading in McGilchrist, and this is how belief and knowledge cannot be separated from action, i.e. you cannot believe inside of your head. And this is proven so many times. It's a common idea that a person like me, I can believe whatever I want. It's so far from the truth, it's not even in the vocabulary. We know for sure it's at least 30 years of research. We can use fMRI, we can use MRI, we can use EEC. This is maybe one of the least things we can do. And since Darwin, we have for 60, 70 years believed that you can think whatever you do. And that, I think, and this is a parenthesis on my side, nothing to do with this matter, it could have led to the wave of atheism. Because if you try to believe from the inside, you won't believe in anything. We know that as a fact. The second is a take from, could you move that a little bit slower, because people get dizzy?
How consciousness developed from language and not the other way around.
This is what I know. He says, in contrast to most people, that consciousness came after language. And this is what sets him apart from everyone. I don't know what the point of Richard E. Lind here, and I don't know what E. McGilchrist says. Could be, I don't know, that E. McGilchrist agrees with him. But this is very different. 3, how concepts are developing at the same time the capacity to plan, reflect, and be aware develops. This we heard before. This is Wittgenstein. This is understanding is doing. Understanding is of the world. And it doesn't mean that it is just the world. It is the world and the inside. And this is very tough nut to crack, because we want to have things either or. But as we know, the left hemisphere, thank you very much, Ian McGilchrist, doesn't allow bothness, whereas the real world assumes bothness, or even thinks in bothness. The right hemisphere, and so does quantum mechanics, always have bothness. But I would say, in ordinary language, in academia today, we have the either or. And to some extent, even development and progression within articles, within reviews, are taking the either or stance. You have a positive view, then you criticize it, and then you come to a conclusion. This way of doing it is of the left hemisphere. And that's even a philosophy by Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. 4, we have good indications coming from Barbara Tversky. Her view here is that complicated concepts always comes from doings. And she shows elegantly from the cave of Lavascaux in southern France, the caves of the Pyrenees in Spain and France, how people, you can see them, how they start to think. It is so obvious. First, it is like they are in the situation. They cannot discern an I from what the situation is. And all of a sudden, you see this very first hint of abstraction. Something is taken out of context. And that is something you cannot see in normal sense, at least not as a Neolithic person. For them, experience was now and here, and you couldn't sort of subtract yourself out of the situation. That is, of course, also impossible for an animal. But I think, and here I also would say that Barbara Tversky and Julian Jaynes are in agreement. There is a big difference, and you can see it yourself. That is, being 100% in the situation. It could be a hunting scene, and it is depicted in a way that you can see that this person is not looking from some other point of view, outside, bird's view, or anything else. That wasn't possible. This is the elegance of Barbara Tversky, shows that it cannot have happened any other way. It is so proving, it is so clear, because all of a sudden in the caves, I borrow these fantastic books of these beautiful, beautiful caves, which I've seen only one in my life. But you see how abstraction starts. So my hypothesis, and this is of course also Lakoff Johnson, who shows that from doings, their more extended view on what metaphor and metonymy is the same as the real world and the inner world coming to life at the very same time. They are on equal footing, so to speak. All other philosophers either say one is lower and the other one is higher. Today we are, I would say the mainstream today is the material is more real, whereas the abstraction is lower, way lower. It used to be the opposite until the early 17th century, I would say. Today there are very few who would say that abstraction is more important. Thank God quantum mechanics says that. And we have on our side also the prominent Ian McGilchrist. But this is rather different. Here,
this sentence is not clear. It shows that this is consciousness, or the research shows, or what is it shows?
There's a word missing here. Sorry. I was becoming too anxious. It shows how functions in language science are doings.
It shows how the functions in language.
This is, I can be unconscious when I sit here and do things. Let's, for example, think that my sunglasses are broken somehow. I can be unconscious in what I'm doing to fix them. I can bend them. The same way, and here Barbara Tversky, if you hold it a little bit stiller, don't move it. Barbara Tversky and Lakoff Johnson, you can be unaware because the thinking tools, what Julian Jaynes called structions, are like things you do, bending, opening up, closing, so you can do rationalization without being properly conscious. And that means the unconsciousness of rationalization doesn't mean that it points to that consciousness is something completely different. So does this. The Neolithic man of the Lavascour cave doesn't necessarily have to be thinking, doing thinking. He just decontextualized. Obviously, this was how it started. And then came thinking. But what happened in this moment, it was the first little gem of consciousness. And to Lakoff Johnson and Barbara Tversky, but especially Julian Jaynes, this I have understood, consciousness is different from rationalization, intellectualization, decontextualization, and recontextualization. It is in its true size and demeanor very different. And that was the reason for his rather long introduction, to show that all other theories, almost bar anyone, they all say that consciousness and reflecting is the same thing, or consciousness or intellectualization is the same thing. Descartes, Hume, Locke, I will have to add to this Rousseau, Voltaire without a doubt, almost everyone. Kant is in between, but he doesn't really specify that consciousness could be something else. So this is a whole new view of consciousness. It is like consciousness is what happened. Let's call this Neolithic guy Burke. And he was the first one who experienced consciousness. And what he did in the cave was the first consciousness. He decontextualized. He got out of the real experience. He was no longer just hunting, cooperating with his teammates to hunting the bison. All of a sudden, he took himself out of the situation. Then came thinking. So consciousness happened before thinking, but thinking came directly afterwards. There's no doubt about that either. 5-10 minutes later or the day after, this Burke could start making conclusions. And what could he do? He could, for instance, count on how many hunters will we need for the next daily hunt, by counting how many bisons there were. And all of a sudden, we see that thinking is developing. So this thing happens, that we have a wholeness here, and a wholeness that you are unaware and unthinking. Everything is unconscious, everything is directly, and all of a sudden there's a split. It's an I that can lift itself out of the situation. And that I is consciousness. It can be involved in the thinking, doesn't have to, but it can. And that can is the most important. It's very, very different. It could be implied in Lakoff Johnson. They don't speak about it explicitly. I think it is there implicitly. And in Barbara Tversky. And it's more to come of Julian Jaynes. This is my first take. Kalle?
So the question is that we can think about is if language is synonymous with consciousness. Language is not easy to define. You have also the pre-language of Derrida, the what is it? What was his term? Archewriting. So language is a difficult concept, but we can think about this problem. Is consciousness synonymous with language? That is not what Jaynes says, but he relates them closely. And I could read one fragment by Heraclitus. I think it's appropriate. Yes, it's fragment 23 in DLs. So the fragment goes as: the Lord whose oracle is in Delphi neither indicates clearly nor conceals, but gives a sign. Gives a sign, thought that is the Greek verb simainei. And I've thinking much about this phrase.
Very good.
I don't know how to... Yeah. And I like the wordplay that you would have in English. So instead of saying gives a sign, I would say, but signs. Signs in the Derridian sense that you actually sign something like a document, but also giving a sign.
Oh yeah.
No, we can think about that.
So this was my first take of Julian Jaynes, the question I got earlier, and I would return to that once I understand this more. but it is extremely interesting to say the least. And what a rare coincidence with the MMM theory from 1887, I think it was, yeah. It's so weird, because this is not something you often heard, Maudie Morrison. Very seldom. I never seen it in writing before. And this has been our specific target for the last week. Odd, to say the least. Maybe it's a sign. I say thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a very nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.